She stepped off the wagon with bruises no one could see, and a name that had been spit on in every parlor back east. 5 women had already run screaming off this mountain. The man waiting at the tree line had a rifle on his shoulder, a beard like winter, and a reputation for sending brides home in pieces. Rowan Mercer wasn't going home. She had nowhere left. If you're still with me, stay till the end. Hit that like button and tell me in the comments what city you're watching from, so I can see how far this story has traveled tonight. The wagon hit a rut hard enough to throw Rowan Mercer against the slat wall, and she bit her tongue, keeping the cry inside her teeth. Blood, warm and metallic. She swallowed it. She had been swallowing things for 11 months now. Pride, hunger, the urge to scream at strangers in train depots, and a little blood was nothing. The driver, a sour man named Pell, who had not spoken 6 full sentences since picking her up in Sage Crossing, glanced back over his shoulder. He had a face like a saddle left out in the rain. "You alive back there?" "Yes." "Don't sound it." "I'm here, Mr. Pell. That's what you're being paid for." He grunted and turned back to the team. The wagon climbed. The road, if a person could call it that, was a pair of wheel ruts gouged into red clay between walls of pine so thick that the afternoon light came down green and old. Somewhere a long way off, a creek talked to itself over stones. Otherwise, there was only the leather creak of the harness, the slow hoof fall of 2 tired mules, and the wet sound of Rowan breathing through her teeth. She had $3.40 folded into the lining of her glove. She had a carpet bag with 2 dresses in it, one of them mended at the elbows. She had a black leather journal wrapped twice in oilcloth and pressed flat against her ribs under her corset, where the bone of it bruised her every time the wagon bucked. And she had a folded sheet of newspaper, soft from handling, that she did not need to read again because she had memorized every word of it on the train. Widowed mountain man, cold hollow territory, seeks wife. Not looking for pretty. Not looking for easy. Work is hard. Winters are worse. 5 have left. Do not write if you cry easy. G. Stone. The girls in the boarding house in Ashbury would have laughed at it. They would have read it aloud at supper and made faces and asked what kind of brute writes his own ad like that, as if a wife were a mule he was buying at auction. Rowan had read it 3 times standing in the lobby of the post office with her last good coat over her arm, and she had not laughed. She had thought, he told the truth. That's more than any man in this city ever did for me. So she had written back. 1 page. No flourishes. I am 26 years old. I am not afraid of work. I have been called difficult by people who meant it as an insult, and I no longer correct them. If you will have me, I will come. She had signed it with her real name, even though her real name was poison on every street between the harbor and the courthouse back home. Rowan Mercer. Let him refuse it. Let him write back and say he had read the papers and would not have the sister of Lucian Mercer on his land. Let him. He had not. He had sent a 1-page reply that arrived at the boarding house in a hand so heavy the pen had cut the paper. Train fare enclosed. Come in October before the pass closes. I am not a kind man, but I do not lie. G.S. She still had the letter. It was inside the journal, between the page where her brother had begun forging her name on transfer drafts and the page where the bank's auditor had finally noticed. "High up," Pell said to the mules. The wagon lurched up a steeper grade. The pines opened a little, and Rowan could see the shoulder of the mountain ahead now. Raw rock streaked white where a slide had come down maybe 10 years back. Above it, the sky was the wrong color for October, yellow at the edges. A storm color. "Mr. Pell." How much farther?" Hour and a quarter if the team don't quit." "And the man, Stone." Pell shifted the reins from one hand to the other and looked at her sideways in a way she had grown used to in the last 3 days. People in this country looked at a woman like they were appraising livestock. Not unkindly, most of them, just thoroughly. She had given up resenting it somewhere around the 2nd night. "You're the 6th, he said. "I know. Last one I drove up made it 11 days. Walked herself down. Cried the whole way to Sage Crossing. Said he never raised a hand to her. Said it was the quiet that did it." He spat over the side of the wagon. "Quiet ain't for everyone." "I'm familiar with quiet." "You'll be more familiar with it by Christmas." She did not answer. She watched the back of his head, the gray hair curling over his collar, the place where the collar was darned with thread that did not match. He was not a cruel man. He was a man who had driven 5 women up this road and then driven each of them back down, and he had decided in advance to drive her down too. He was simply waiting to be proven right. The carpetbag at her feet had a tear in the side from a porter in Sage Crossing who had thrown it harder than necessary. The bag had belonged to her mother. Her mother had been dead 4 years and would, Rowan was reasonably sure, have refused to recognize her now. The Mercers do not advertise themselves. The Mercers do not go west. The Mercers do not associate with men who write to newspapers as if they were posting a hog for sale. Her mother had said variations on these sentences her entire life, even when there had been no money left to back them up with, even at the end when the only thing the Mercers had left to associate with were creditors and rumor. Her mother had died believing Lucien was a good son. That was the one mercy in the timing of all of it. Her mother had not lived to read the headlines. Her mother had not lived to see her daughter walked out of the bank in handcuffs that turned out, after 8 days, to be applied to the wrong sibling. Her mother had not lived to see the apology printed on page 9 in type so small that no one read it, while the original accusation had run on page 1 in letters 2 inches tall. Mercer heiress charged. Fraud at First Maritime. She had not been an heiress. There had been nothing left to inherit but debts. But it had sold papers, and the papers had sold her, and by the time she was released, innocent, the prosecutor had said in a voice flat with embarrassment, the accused has been cleared, the matter is closed. By the time she was released, the boarding houses would not have her, the church ladies crossed the street, and her own aunt had sent back her letters unopened with return to sender. No such person. Written across the front in a hand Rowan had known since childhood. Lucien, of course, had vanished. Lucien always vanished. The wagon broke out of the pines into a meadow that climbed in slow yellow waves up to a cabin she did not see at first because it was the same color as the rock behind it. Smoke came out of the chimney in a thin, straight line, the kind of smoke that meant a fire kept low and watched. There were 2 outbuildings. A pole corral with a single horse in it, dark, big, in the chest. A pile of split wood as tall as a man, stacked so clean it looked drawn with a ruler. And standing in front of all of it, with one boot up on a stump and a rifle in the crook of his arm in the casual way some men carry a hat, was Garrick Stone. Rowan had not let herself imagine him. She had refused that small luxury through the whole long train ride west. She would meet him and he would be whatever he was. And imagining first would only mean disappointment later, or worse, the opposite of disappointment, which was the kind of hope that got a woman hurt. He was tall. That was the first thing. Even at a distance, he was tall enough that Pell's mules looked small as they came up the slope. He had the kind of beard a man grew because shaving in winter was foolish, dark with some gray in it, though he could not be over 35. His coat was wool and ugly and well made. His boots were caked with new mud. He did not wave. He did not move at all. He watched the wagon come. Pell pulled the team to a stop maybe 20 feet from him and set the brake. Stone. Pell. Brought you another. I see that. The 2 men looked at each other across the meadow for a long second, and Rowan understood, with the kind of clarity that comes only when one is too tired to flatter oneself, that they were both waiting to see how soon she was going to cry. She gathered her skirt, planted her boot on the wheel hub, and climbed down without help. The drop was farther than she had judged, and she landed harder than she meant to, and a small shock of pain went up through her right ankle into her hip, and she did not let it show on her face. She turned and lifted her own carpetbag down. It weighed 9 pounds. She had weighed it on a grocer's scale before leaving Ashbury because she had wanted to know exactly how much of her life she was carrying. She walked across the muddy yard to the man with the rifle. She did not stop until she was close enough to see that his eyes were a strange pale color, almost no color at all, a winter sky gray. Mr. Stone. Ma'am. Rowan Mercer. I know who you are. Then we can skip the part where I explain myself. A muscle moved in his jaw. It might have been a smile, beginning and then deciding not to. He looked past her at Pell. You can come back for her in 11 days like the last one, or you can not come back at all. Up to you. Pell snorted. I'll be through next Tuesday with the mail. I'll holler. Holler from the trees, don't come up to the house. Never have. Stone reached into his coat pocket and produced a folded bill. He handed it to Pell without looking at him. Pell took it without looking at Stone. There was something old and worn smooth about the way they did this, a small ceremony between two men who did not particularly like each other but had long since stopped needing to. Pell touched his hat brim at Rowan, said, "Good luck, ma'am," in a tone that contained no luck whatsoever, and turned the team. The wagon rolled back down the meadow. The creak of the harness got smaller and smaller, and then the pine swallowed it, and there was no sound left in the world except a hawk somewhere very high up and the slow breath of the dark horse in the corral. Rowan and Garrick Stone stood 10 feet apart in the mud. "Well," he said. "Well," she said. He set the rifle butt down against the stump and crossed his arms. Up close, he was even bigger than he had looked from the wagon, and she realized she had been bracing herself unconsciously, the way she used to brace herself walking past men in the alley behind the boarding house. She made herself unclench. "You're not what I asked for." "You asked for a wife." "I'm a wife." "I asked for a frontier woman." "You asked for someone who wouldn't cry easy. That's different." He looked at her for a long moment, the pale eyes unreadable. "5 women left here, Mrs. Mercer." "Miss Mercer, until you decide otherwise." 5 women left. The first one took 2 days, the fastest. The last one took 11 and walked herself out. They were strong women. Some of them were strong like you, with that look you've got, where the chin comes up before the answer. The mountain doesn't care about the chin. Do you understand me? "I understand you fine." "I don't think you do. Try me." He uncrossed his arms. He picked up her carpet bag without asking, hefted it once to feel the weight, and started toward the cabin. She followed. She had to take a step and a half for every one of his. "Cabin's 2 rooms," he said, walking. "Big room and the loft. I sleep in the loft. You'll have the bunk by the stove for now. There's a curtain on a rope. It's not much. It's what there is. All right? There's a privy out back. There's a creek for water. The creek freezes in December and will be melting snow from then to April. There's a milk cow named Iris, and she will kick you if she doesn't know you. There are 6 laying hens. There were 8. A fox got 2 in September. There is a root cellar, and the door sticks. There is a smokehouse, and you do not go in it without telling me." "Why?" He stopped walking. He looked back at her. "Because there's a side of elk hanging in it, and if you let the wrong air in, 2 months of work goes bad." "Oh. What did you think I meant?" "I didn't know." He almost smiled again. It was an unsettling thing, that smile, because it kept refusing to happen. "You'll learn the rules. There aren't many of them. The mountain has more rules than I do, and the mountain's the one to be afraid of." He started walking again. "You ever fired a rifle?" "No." "You will." "You ever skinned an animal?" "No." "You will." "You ever buried one?" She did not answer right away. The wind came down off the rock and stirred her hair into her eyes, and she put it back with the heel of her hand. "I've buried a mother and most of a name, Mr. Stone. An animal will be easier." He stopped at the cabin door with his hand on the latch, and this time he did look at her, fully, and she felt the weight of those gray eyes go all the way down through her like a sounding line dropped into cold water. "That's the first thing you've said," he told her, "that I half believe." He opened the door and went in. The inside of the cabin was darker than the outside and smelled of pine resin, wood smoke, and something else she identified after a moment as sage, hanging in bundles from a beam over the stove. The floor was plank swept clean. The walls were chinked log. There was a table made of 2 planks on sawhorses, 2 chairs that did not match, a stove with a kettle on it, and a bunk built into the wall under a small square window. The bunk had a straw tick on it and a folded gray blanket and nothing else. The curtain he had mentioned was a length of unbleached linen on a rope and was currently pushed all the way to one side. There was a Bible on a shelf. There was a tin of coffee. There was a rifle on pegs above the door and a smaller rifle on pegs under it. There were 2 cast iron pans hanging from nails. There was a sewing basket on the bunk with thread in it and a thimble and a half-mended shirt, and Rowan looked at the sewing basket for a long second before she understood that it had been left there by one of the 5. Garrick set her bag down beside the bunk. "You hungry?" "I can wait." "That wasn't the question." "Yes, I'm hungry." "There's stew. It's been on since this morning. Take off your coat." She took off her coat. She hung it on the peg beside his, which was a much bigger coat, and seeing the two coats next to each other did something to her chest she did not want to examine just then. She rolled up her sleeves. The bruise on her forearm from the train berth had gone yellow at the edges. She did not try to hide it. He saw it. He did not say anything. He ladled stew into 2 tin bowls. There was bread, a heel of it, dark and dense, that he tore in half with his hands. There was butter in a crock with a cloth over it. They sat at the 2-plank table with the bowls between them, and they ate without talking for almost a full minute. The stew had elk in it. She knew because he told her so on the second spoonful, as if reading her mind. "This is good," she said. "It's food. It's good food." "You don't have to flatter the cook, Miss Mercer." "I'm not. I haven't had a hot meal in 3 days that wasn't from a station counter. This is the best thing I've put in my mouth since Ohio." He looked up from his bowl. Some of the watchfulness was gone from his face. Not all, some. "What were you in Ohio for? Changing trains? And before that?" "Ashbury." "Where in Ashbury?" "Lyle Street, a boarding house run by a woman named Mrs. Purnell, who put me out the morning after my name was in the papers." "Your name was in the papers. You said you knew who I was." "I know what you wrote me. I know your brother's name was in a letter from the territorial assessor that came through Cold Hollow 2 weeks ago. I know there's a man named Damian Crow down the valley who's been asking questions about land titles in a tone I don't care for. I put the names together because I'm not stupid, Miss Mercer, but I haven't read your papers. I haven't read a paper in 4 years. I don't care what they said. I'm asking what happened." She set her spoon down. The cabin was very quiet. The fire in the stove popped once. "My brother is Lucien Mercer. He worked at First Maritime Bank. He moved money that wasn't his into accounts that weren't real and out again into a third place I couldn't trace. He used my signature on 3 of the transfers. When the auditor caught it, he was already on a train to somewhere I don't know. They came for me instead. I was in a cell for 8 days. They let me out because the handwriting expert finally agreed that the signature was a forgery, which I had been telling them since the second hour. The bank apologized in a letter. The newspaper apologized on page 9. The boarding house did not apologize at all. She picked up the spoon again. She made herself eat. The stew was still good. The stew did not know about Lucien. "And the family," Garrick said. "My mother is dead. My father is dead. My aunt sent my letters back. There is no one else. There was a man briefly who said he would wait. He did not wait. There is a cousin in Sacramento I have never met. That is the family." "Why didn't you go to Sacramento?" "Because I am not going to throw myself on the mercy of a man who has never seen my face. I'd rather throw myself on the mercy of a man who at least told me in writing that he had none." That smile again. "Almost, not quite." "I have some," he said. "Mercy. I have a little. I ration it." "That's fair. I'm going to ask you something, Miss Mercer, and I want a straight answer." "All right. Did your brother send you here?" The question landed on the table between them like a dropped knife. She felt the blood go out of her face and come back into it, hot. "No." "Think about that answer." "I don't have to. No, he did not. I do not know where he is. If I knew, I would have already gone there and broken his nose." "You'd break a man's nose." "His specifically." Garrick looked at her for a long time. Then he nodded once, very slightly, the way a man nods to himself when a sum comes out right. "All right." "All right what?" "All right, I believe you." He went back to his stew. "If I find out I'm wrong, you'll be off this mountain in an hour, and not in Pell's wagon. Are we clear?" "We're clear. Eat your bread." She ate her bread. That night, behind the linen curtain, in a bunk that smelled of straw and faintly of some other woman's lavender water from a long time ago, Rowan Mercer lay awake and listened to the mountain. It was not silent. That was the first thing she had to revise about everything she thought she knew. The mountain was loud. It was loud in a slow, patient way that took a city ear time to hear. The wind moved through the pines and made a sound like surf. An owl spoke once, very near, and then again much farther off, as if the first one had moved between calls. The cabin log settled and groaned the way old men did getting out of chairs. The stove ticked as it cooled. Above her, in the loft, Garrick's stone turned over once on a rope bed and the rope creaked, and then he was still. She thought he was asleep. She could not tell. She put her hand flat on her stomach over her nightdress and felt, through the cotton, the hard square of the journal she had tucked under the straw tick. She had not opened the journal in front of him. She would not yet. Not until she had decided whether the man in the loft was the kind of man you trusted with paper or the kind of man you trusted with everything except paper, which were two very different categories, and she had only learned recently that they existed. The journal contained 11 months of work. It contained names, dates, and 3 account numbers she had pulled from a wastebasket at the bank during the 8 days they had let her keep her job before the arrest. It contained the name of a shipping clerk in Baltimore who had taken her aside in a hallway and whispered to her about a man named Crow who paid in cash. It contained a letter from a widow in Pennsylvania whose farm had been bought for 1/10 of its value by an agent representing a syndicate whose corporate papers, when she finally tracked them down at the county clerk's office in Harrisburg, listed Lucian Mercer as one of 3 principals. It contained, in other words, the beginning of a noose. She had been weaving it slowly, in lamplight, in rented rooms, between jobs scrubbing other people's stairs, because revenge was a long thing, and she had nothing else to spend her evenings on. She had not come to Cold Hollow for love. She had not come for safety. She had come for distance and for time, and because the advertisement of a man named Stone had felt, when she read it, like the first honest sentence she had encountered in a year. She did not know yet that the noose she had been weaving in Ashbury had a second end, and the second end was already tied around a man in this valley. She closed her eyes. She listened to the wind in the pines. She slept. She woke before dawn to the sound of the stove door opening. For one disoriented second, she did not know where she was, and her hand went under the straw tick for the journal, and she felt it there, and remembered. She lay still. Through the gap at the top of the curtain, she could see the orange flicker as he built up the fire. She could hear the small, clean sounds of a man who had done this every morning of his adult life. The click of the damper, the rasp of a match, the pour of water from the bucket into the kettle. He did not speak. He did not look toward the curtain. He was giving her the privacy of pretending he could not hear her breathing. She listened to him for a long time. Then she sat up, swung her legs out, pulled her dress on over the nightdress because there was no warmth in the cabin yet, and put her stockinged feet on the cold plank floor. She came out from behind the curtain. He was at the stove with his back to her. He had on a gray flannel shirt and suspenders and the same wool trousers, and his hair was damp at the back of the neck, as if he had already washed his face at the basin by the door. "Morning," she said. "Morning. What can I do?" He turned. He looked at her standing there in her plain brown dress, with her hair in a quick braid over one shoulder, and again that thing happened in his face. The small movement that might have been the start of a smile, and then was not. "You can get the eggs." "All right." "Coop's behind the smokehouse. Watch the rooster. He's mean." "How mean?" "Mean enough I broke his beak last spring. He hasn't forgiven me." "Should I bring a stick?" "Bring a stick. Don't kill him. He keeps the hens producing." She went to the door. She put on her coat. She slid her feet into her boots, which were still damp from yesterday's mud. She picked up a length of split kindling from the wood box by the door, because that was the only stick she could see, and she went out into the morning. The cold hit her in the chest like cold water. The sky was just beginning to gray at the eastern shoulder of the mountain. The grass was white with frost. Her breath came out of her in a long, pale plume. She stood for a moment on the step of the cabin and looked at the meadow and the pines and the dark cut of the road that led down to the valley she could not see from here, and she thought very clearly and without any particular feeling about it, "This might be my home." It was not yet. It might never be. But for the first time in 11 months, since the morning 2 policemen had come up the stairs at Lyle Street and a woman she had thought was her friend had stood in a doorway with her arms folded and watched it happen, Rowan Mercer was standing somewhere where someone knew the worst about her and had let her in anyway. He had done it suspiciously. He had done it with a rifle and questions and the offer of a wagon back down the mountain if she failed his arithmetic. But he had done it. That was something. She walked across the frost to the hen house. The rooster came out of the gloom at her like a small feathered demon, and she met him with the kindling, and he reconsidered. She gathered 4 warm eggs into the lifted hem of her apron, which she had thought to put on at the last second. She walked back across the frost holding the eggs against her belly with one hand and the kindling held loose in the other, and Garrick Stone was standing in the cabin doorway watching her come, and the light caught the side of his face, and she saw for the first time that there was a scar at the corner of his mouth, an old one, white in the dark beard. She gave him the eggs without speaking. He took them without speaking. They went inside. That was the first morning. There were many mornings. She would, much later, when she tried to tell the story to a federal prosecutor who needed the order of events for a closing argument, lose track of which day exactly something had first happened. Was it the third morning she had learned to milk Iris, or the fifth? Was it the second week or the third that he had taken her up the ridge and shown her how to load and fire the smaller rifle, the one he said had been his mother's, and she had hit the tin can on the fourth try? And he had said, "Huh." The way some men said, "Well done." She could not place these things on a calendar. They had bled together into something that was not a sequence, but a weather, a season of being slowly less afraid. What she remembered clearly was this. She remembered the day Iris first let her sit at her flank without flinching, and the milk hit the pail in that fat, steady rhythm, and Rowan put her forehead against the cow's warm side and laughed, and Garrick, splitting wood 20 feet away, did not look up. But the rhythm of his axe changed for half a beat, as if he had smiled and gone on swinging. She remembered the night the wind came down off the ridge so hard that the cabin door rattled on its leather hinges and a shingle came off the roof, and she had gotten up without being told and held the door braced with her shoulder while he climbed the loft ladder and went out the loft window onto the roof to nail the shingle back. And when he came in, his beard was white with ice, and he had looked at her holding the door and said, "You should have woken me." And she had said, "I did. You were already up." And they had stared at each other for a moment with the wind howling around the chinking, and then he had laughed. Once. A short, startled sound, like a man hearing a familiar song from a long way off. She remembered the Sunday a wagon came up the road, and a woman named Esther Halloran climbed down from it, weather-burned and short and built like a barrel, with a basket of cornbread and a half-pound of butter, and she had walked up to Rowan with no preamble and said, "I'm your nearest neighbor. I'm 3 miles down. You ever need a thing, you walk 3 miles down. I do not knit, and I do not gossip, but I am not stupid, and I am not unkind. Welcome to the country, Mrs. Stone." Rowan had opened her mouth to correct her, Miss Mercer, and then had closed it. Garrick, in the doorway, had not corrected her either. They had not spoken of it after Esther left. But that night at supper, Rowan had said, "Esther Halloran called me Mrs. Stone." And Garrick had said, without looking up from his plate, "Esther is rarely wrong about people." And that had been the whole of the conversation, but Rowan had lain awake a long time afterward thinking about it. She remembered the morning she had found him on his knees in the corral with the dark horse's foreleg across his thigh, working a stone out of the frog of its hoof with a piece of bent wire, swearing softly and steadily under his breath in a way that suggested he did not know she was there. And she had stood and watched him for a full minute and seen very clearly that this enormous, frightening man was gentle with the horse. It was a small thing. It was everything. She remembered the first time he had touched her on purpose. It was in the barn, the small barn behind the smokehouse, and she had been climbing down from the loft where she had been throwing hay, and her boot had skidded on the third rung of the ladder, and he had been below her, and he had caught her by the waist with both hands as easily as a man catches a falling coat. He had not held her. He had set her on her feet and stepped back and said, "Watch that third rung," and gone back to what he was doing. But his hands had been very warm through her dress, and very large, and she had stood at the foot of the ladder for several seconds afterward before she remembered that she had things to do. She remembered, most of all, the evening in the second month when he had come in from the woodlot with his shirt sleeves soaked dark, and the axe blade still in his other hand because he had not wanted to leave it in the snow. "Garrick," she had said. She had not used his first name yet before that moment. It came out of her without permission. "It's nothing. Sit down. It's a clip. I caught the helve wrong. Sit. Down." And he had, because something in her voice had not been arguing. She had pulled his sleeve up. His arm was thick and warm, and there was an old burn scar on the inside of the forearm that she did not ask about. And she had seen that the gash was longer than he had said, and was going to need stitching. She had heated water. She had sterilized the needle in the lamp flame the way she had once watched a doctor do it in a clinic in Ashbury. She had stitched his arm 7 times by lamplight while he sat at the 2-plank table with his jaw set and his free hand flat on the wood and did not make a single sound. When she was done, she had tied off the thread and wrapped the arm in clean linen torn from a flour sack, and she had looked up and found him looking at her with an expression she had not seen on a man's face before, not directed at her. "Where did you learn that?" he had said quietly. "I didn't, I guessed. Guess again sometime." She had laughed. She had not meant to. It had come out of her like a sneeze, and he had smiled, finally, a real smile that went all the way to those pale gray eyes and crinkled the skin at the corners, and it had only lasted a second, but she had seen it. She had it now. She could keep it. That night she had moved the journal. She had taken it out from under the straw tick where it had lived for 6 weeks, and she had wrapped it again in its oilcloth, and she had carried it up to the loft when he was outside checking the horse, and she had slid it under his pillow on the rope bed because she had decided, suddenly and without consulting herself first, that whatever was in those pages now belonged to both of them or to neither of them. She had climbed back down the ladder. She had been at the stove stirring something when he came in. He had gone up to the loft to change his shirt. There had been a silence, then his boots on the ladder, coming down again. Then him in the kitchen behind her, and his hand on her elbow, very light, turning her. He had the journal in his other hand. "What is this?" he had said. "Sit down," she had said. "I'll tell you all of it." And she had. She had told him everything. She had told him about Lucien and the bank and the 8 days in the cell. She had told him about the shipping clerk in Baltimore and the widow in Pennsylvania and the corporate papers in Harrisburg. She had told him she had spent 11 months gathering it, not because she expected anyone to listen, but because the gathering had been the only thing keeping her from going to the river. She had told him she had not told him sooner because she had not known whether she was bringing a noose into his house, and that if he wanted her off the mountain in the morning, she would understand and there would be no argument. He had listened. He had listened the way she had not, in her life, been listened to before. He had not interrupted. He had not made a face. He had read 3 pages of the journal while she talked, and then he had closed it and put it on the table between them and put his big hand flat on top of it. "Damien Crowe," he had said. "You know him. He's been up here twice. He wants the southwest quarter. He says it's for a hunting lodge. He's lying. He's a polite man who lies, which is the worst kind." She had stared at him. "Garrick. He's in the journal. 3 pages in. The Pennsylvania Syndicate. He's one of the names." "I know. I just read it. They're working together. Lucien and Crowe, they have to be. The dates? I know. What do we do?" He had looked at her for a long time across the lamplight. The cabin had been very quiet. The fire had popped. Iris, in the small barn, had stamped once and gone still. "We don't run," he had said. "No," she had said. "We don't run." And outside the cabin, a long way off down the valley, in a hotel in Cold Hollow that had once been a stage stop, a polite man in a clean shirt was at that very moment writing a letter to a partner back east, asking him to come quickly because there was a small, loose thread on a mountain at the head of the valley that wanted tying off. He signed it D. Crowe. He did not yet know whose mountain it was. He had been told the man's name and forgotten it. Men like Garrick Stone were, in his experience, a category, not an individual. He would learn the difference. The letter went out of Cold Hollow on a Tuesday with the eastbound mail, and by Thursday morning Damien Crowe was on his second cup of coffee in the dining room of the Halverson Hotel, watching snow blow sideways past the window glass and waiting for the man he had sent for to step down off the stage. He was not a man who waited well, but he had learned to do it without showing it. He sat with his back to the wall and his hat on the chair beside him, and a folded newspaper open to a page he was not reading. He was 41 years old. He had a clean-shaven face that the women in Cold Hollow had agreed, in the unspoken way women in small towns agree, was a handsome face if you did not look at it for too long. The eyes were the trouble. The eyes were brown and warm, and they listened to you with great attention, and after about a minute of sustained attention from those eyes, a person began to feel as if a careful inventory was being taken of them, and the inventory was not quite friendly. Bessie Halverson, who ran the dining room and had buried 2 husbands and did not feel the need to listen to a third, brought him a fresh pot without being asked and set it down hard enough to slop a little onto the saucer. "Mr. Crowe." "Mrs. Halverson." "Snow's coming in heavy." "It is." "Stage may not make it today." "It will make it." "You sound sure of that." "I am sure of it." I am paying the driver an additional sum to be sure of it." Bessie looked at him for a moment with the particular flat expression of a woman who had decided some time ago what she thought of a man and was simply waiting to be proven right or wrong. Then she walked away without another word. Crow lifted the coffee. He did not flinch at the heat. The stage came in at 10:30, an hour late, the horses steaming and the driver white to the lips with cold. The man who stepped down from it was wrapped in a black wool coat with a fur collar, and he carried a leather case in one hand and a silver-headed walking stick in the other that he did not, Crow noticed, actually need to walk. He was tall and lean, and his hair was the color of wet straw. And when he took off his glove to shake Crow's hand, his fingers were long and clean, and there was a thin, pale band of skin on the fourth one, where a ring had been until very recently. "Crow, Mr. Sellers, it's a hell of a country you've got me out to." "It is. Come inside, there's a fire." They sat at the corner table farthest from the kitchen, and Bessie brought them coffee with the same flat expression, and Crow waited until she was back behind the counter before he spoke. "I appreciate you coming on short notice. Your letter was unusually short. There wasn't much to say in writing. There rarely is with you." Crow smiled a small, polite smile that did not reach the warm brown eyes. "There's a man up the valley, Stone. He has a quarter section at the head of the pass that I need. He has refused 2 offers. The offers were generous." "How generous?" "Generous enough that the second offer was an insult disguised as a courtesy." Sellers turned his coffee cup a quarter turn on the saucer. He had a habit of small, precise gestures with his hands, like a man counting something invisible. "Then why are we still discussing it?" "Because he took a wife last month." "Congratulations to him." "The wife is Rowan Mercer." Sellers' hand stopped on the cup. The silence that followed was the kind of silence that sits down at a table and pulls up its own chair. The fire in the dining room hearth cracked once. Bessie, behind the counter, was doing something with a cloth and a tin pan and was not looking at them, but Crow knew, in the back of his mind where he kept the inventory of all rooms he entered, that her hands had slowed. He did not look at Bessie. "You're certain," Sellers said. "I had a man on the train when she came west. I had a man at Sage Crossing when Pell picked her up. I have had a man making a slow ride past the foot of Stone's Road once a week for the past 6 weeks. She is not visiting. She is staying." "Does she know you're here?" "She knows the name. She does not know the face. She has never met me. We may yet keep it that way." "And the brother?" "The brother is in St. Louis, last I had word, drinking himself stupid in a hotel I am paying for. The brother is the least of our problems. The brother is a child with a pen. The sister is the one who put the auditor on him in the first place, Sellers. The sister kept records." "How do you know that?" "Because I have done business with women like her before. And women like her always keep records. It is what they do instead of carrying a knife." Sellers exhaled slowly through his nose. He looked down at the coffee. He looked up. "What do you want?" "I want the land. I want the records. I want the records gone. In that order, if possible. In whatever order it falls out, if not." "And the woman?" Crow took a long, deliberate moment before answering. He set his cup down. He folded his hands on the table. "The woman is to be discredited," he said, "publicly, thoroughly, in front of as many people as will fit in the Territorial Assembly Hall on the day of the harvest gathering. She is to be reminded, in front of every rancher and widow and storekeep in this valley, exactly who she is and what her name has been printed under. She is to be made small. After that she will leave. They always leave. And if she does not, then we will revisit the question, but she will." Sellers was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You are angrier about this than the situation requires." "I am not angry." "You are. I have known you 11 years. You are angry." Crow did not answer. He picked up the coffee again. His hand was steady. He was angry, and Sellers was correct. And Crow was angry that Sellers had said so out loud. He was angry because he had spent 6 years building a structure of polite paper and signed names and small smiling threats. And a clerk's daughter from Ashbury with a black notebook had, without ever meeting him, put a finger on the one nail that, if pulled, would let the whole thing slide. He had not built this to be undone by a woman whose own family had thrown her into the street. "Do your job," he said. "I always do." "Do it quietly." "I always do that too." Sellers finished his coffee. He stood. He picked up the leather case and the unnecessary walking stick, and he went up the stairs to the room Crow had reserved for him. And Crow sat alone at the table by the window for another 20 minutes watching the snow. Bessie came over once to refill the pot. She did not look at him this time. She did not need to. He understood, in a way he could not have explained without admitting too much about himself, that the woman behind the counter had heard enough to know the shape of what had been said, and that the shape had displeased her. He filed that away. He filed away every dislike that crossed his path. Most of them never mattered. Some of them did. He laid 2 coins on the table for the coffee and went out into the snow. Up on the mountain, that same morning, Rowan Mercer was on her hands and knees in the smokehouse with a lantern in one hand and a piece of charcoal in the other, marking on the back wall the exact dimensions of a hole she did not want anyone else to find. She had not planned it that way. She had gone in to check the elk side the way Garrick had taught her, and she had noticed, only because she happened to bring the lantern down low, that one of the bottom boards of the back wall was not seated the way the others were. The nailing was old and the wood was older, and the board had a hair more give to it than its neighbors. She had pried it with the back of a hatchet. It had come away in her hand like a tooth. Behind it, in a hollow scooped out of the dirt of the foundation, there had been a tin box. The tin box had a hasp but no lock. Inside the tin box, when she carried it back to the cabin and set it on the 2-plank table in front of Garrick, there were 3 things: a packet of letters tied with a piece of leather lace, a brass-framed daguerreotype of a woman with a long, sober face and dark hair pulled back severely, and a small drawstring pouch that, when emptied into Garrick's palm, gave up 9 gold coins and a wedding band considerably smaller than the band of his own finger. He had looked at the daguerreotype for a long time. He had not said anything. Rowan had not asked. She had understood, with the same understanding that had made her stop correcting Esther Halloran 2 months earlier, that there were chapters of this man's life that she was going to learn slowly or not at all, and that it was not her place to hurry him. Finally he had said, "That was Mira. Your wife. My wife." He had set the daguerreotype back into the box. 8 years ago this March, fever come through the valley. We were 3 weeks shy of having a child. Garrick, I am not telling you to be told sorry, Rowan. I know. I am telling you so you know whose house you walked into. She had nodded. She had not touched him. He would not, she had learned, have wanted to be touched in that moment. He had a way of going still and large like a tree when a feeling got close to him, and the way to be near him then was to be near him quietly, like weather. I didn't know about the box, he had said. I'd have put it somewhere better. The coins are hers. Her father gave her those. I never touched them. They're still yours. They're ours now. If we get through what's coming. He had said that if we get through what's coming, in a voice so level she had not understood at first that it was the most frightening sentence he had ever spoken to her. She understood now, 2 days later, on her knees in the smokehouse, with the charcoal in her hand, that he had been telling her, in the only way he knew how, that he had already started counting the cost. She marked the wall. She put the board back. She tapped it home with the heel of her boot, and she carried the tin box back to the cabin under her coat, because they had agreed that the journal and the box and the wedding band and Mira's 9 gold coins were all going to live, from now on, in the same place, and that the place was going to be one only the 2 of them knew. The snow had started by the time she crossed the yard. It came down in big, slow flakes that did not seem to be in any hurry, and the smoke from the chimney lay flat along the roofline because there was no wind under the cloud, and the meadow looked, for one queer moment, like a thing inside a glass paperweight. She stopped on the step and looked at it. She thought, I have been here 10 weeks. She had been here 10 weeks, and somewhere inside her, without her permission and without ceremony, the word here had quietly stopped meaning Garrick's cabin and started meaning the place she lived. She went inside. He was at the table cleaning the smaller rifle, the one that had been his mother's, the one she had been firing twice a week now since the 2nd month. He looked up. You were a while. There was a board loose. Show me. Later. I put the box under the loose floor plank, the one by the bunk. It'll keep dry there. He nodded. He set the rifle aside. He pushed out the second chair with his foot, and she sat down across from him, and they looked at each other across the wood for a moment in the way they had developed of looking at each other, which was a way that contained a great deal and required almost no words. Esther rode up while you were out, he said. I didn't hear a horse. She didn't come up to the cabin. She left a note pinned to the corral gate. She said Crow sent for a man and the man came in on yesterday's stage. Damn, that was my word. What does Esther know about the man? She says he's been here once before, about 6 years back, before my time in the valley. She says he was at the Halverson then, too. She says the way he holds a coffee cup makes her teeth itch. Esther. Esther doesn't say a thing she hasn't seen with her own eyes. Rowan sat with that for a moment. She had only met Esther Halloran half a dozen times now, in the small, brisk visits Esther made every other Sunday, and which Esther seemed to consider a neighborly obligation rather than a pleasure, but she had come to trust Esther's flat, short sentences the way a sailor trusted a barometer. Esther did not exaggerate. If Esther said the man's coffee cup made her teeth itch, then the man was something to be watched. We need to get word out to more people, Rowan said. We do. And not at the gathering. Before. I thought the same. You go to Esther's. You tell her enough. You ask her who else in the valley has had a polite man with a contract come to their door in the last 2 years. Anyone. Widows. Men whose sons died in the war and left the title sloppy. Anyone with a hole in their paper. I'll go in the morning. Take the dark horse. I was going to. She almost smiled. He almost smiled back. They did not. It had become a small habit between them, the not quite smiling, as if they were both saving the real ones for a day they could not yet afford. Garrick. I want to write a letter. To who? To a man in Baltimore, a shipping clerk. He's the one I wrote about on page 9 of the journal. He didn't come forward because his wife is sick and he can't risk his place. But if I tell him there's a federal man involved now, or there will be, he might write a sworn statement. He might let me use his name. You don't know yet that there's a federal man. I will. He looked at her. How? I'm going to ride down to the railhead at Sage Crossing on Friday and send a telegram to a prosecutor in Ashbury whose name I know. He failed me once. He owes me. He doesn't know he owes me. I'm going to remind him. Rowan. Yes. It's 2 days down and 2 back. In this weather, it's 3 and 3. I don't want you on that road alone. You can't come. You have to go to Esther's and then to the Vaughn place. And Pell told me last week that the Vaughn's youngest is laid up with the lung fever and they need a man to help split for them. They're an hour past Esther's. You can do both in a day if you start before light. I can do Sage Crossing in 3. I'll be fine. I have the small rifle. I have Iris's pasture mare. She knows the road. She's gone down it 60 times. It is not the mare I am worried about. I know. He sat very still for a moment. He put both hands flat on the table the way he did when he was deciding something. She watched the knuckles. The right thumb had a small white scar across the joint that she had stitched. She had stitched it the second week. He had bled on her apron and she had not minded then, and she did not mind now. All right, he said. All right. You take the smaller rifle. You take the long coat. You take the oilskin. You take the second pair of gloves. If the snow gets worse than this, you turn around. I don't care if you're an hour from Sage Crossing. You turn around. Do you hear me? I hear you. Say it back to me. I turn around if the snow gets worse than this. Say all of it. I take the small rifle, the long coat, the oilskin, the second gloves, and I turn around if the weather turns. He nodded once. He picked up the rifle again. He began to clean it. And if a man on the road tries to stop you, I shoot him. You shoot the horse. What? You shoot his horse first. He'll stop to deal with the horse. Then you ride. A man on foot in this country cannot catch a woman on a horse who isn't stopping to help him. She stared at him. All right. Promise me. I promise you. And Rowan. Yes. If you do shoot a man's horse, you don't tell anyone you did it. People in this valley care a great deal about horses. Do you hear me? I hear you. He almost smiled. So did she. They went back to not quite smiling at each other, and outside the cabin the snow kept coming down in big, slow flakes. And somewhere out on the road 2 long days away, Sellers, in a fresh rented buggy with a heavy bay in the traces, was on his way up the valley in the storm with a leather case on the seat beside him, and a piece of paper in the case that bore Rowan Mercer's name in 3 different forgeries. He was a careful man. He had brought the forgeries with him from the East because he had known, before stepping off the train, what was going to be asked of him. He had not asked Crow for them. He had taken them out of a locked drawer in his office 2 weeks before Crow's letter had even arrived. Because Sellers had known, in the long, quiet way he knew things, that the loose thread on Crow's Mountain was going to need tying off before winter, and he had been ready. Sellers had been ready for a great many years. It was the central fact of his professional life. The buggy crested a low rise in the road and came in sight of the Halloran place from a quarter-mile off. And Sellers, who never went into a house without knowing the layout of its outbuildings first, pulled the bay to a walk and let it cool. And he sat on the buggy seat in the falling snow and looked down at the small stone-chinked house and the long shed and the smoke from the chimney and the line of fence posts running off east toward where, he had been told, the head of the valley narrowed up into Garrick Stone's land. He did not that day drive onto Esther Halloran's gate. He did not need to. He had only wanted to see it. He turned the buggy around at the rise and went back down the valley. He had 3 calls to make in Cold Hollow that afternoon, all of them at houses where, 6 and 7 years ago, papers had been signed in his presence that none of the signers fully remembered signing. He intended to remind them. He intended to remind them in the gentle, particular way he had of reminding people, which was less a threat than a kind of weather, a kind of slow, cold pressure that made them want to please him without quite knowing why. He had done this in 18 towns. He had done it in territories where the law did not yet exist. And he had done it in cities where the law existed but worked for him. He did not consider what he did dishonest. He considered it the natural movement of property, from people who could not defend it into the hands of people who could. He did not think about Rowan Mercer in any detail. Crow had asked for her to be made small, and Sellers would make her small. That was a Tuesday's work. He had no way of knowing that 2 days from then, on a road 40 miles south of Cold Hollow, in a stretch of pine canyon called the Notch, where the wind funneled the snow into a kind of standing white wall, and a person could lose sight of the road inside of 10 seconds, Rowan Mercer would meet a man on a tall gray horse who would try to put a hand on her bridle. The man would not be one of Sellers's. Sellers had not yet got that far. The man would be a freelancer hired by a clerk in Cold Hollow who had been paid in advance by Crow to keep an eye on the road up to Stone's Mountain, and the clerk had told the man to make trouble if a woman came down it alone. And the man, who was 22 years old and not very bright and badly in need of $40, had agreed. He would come out of the trees on the right-hand side at the narrow place, and he would say, "Ma'am, hold up there a minute," in a voice that was trying to sound friendly. And Rowan would feel the small rifle across her thighs under the oilskin, and she would feel her heart go up into her throat the way it had not gone in 11 months, not since the morning of the arrest. And she would say very clearly, "I do not know you, sir. Step back." And he would not step back. He would step forward. He would put his hand on her mare's bridle near the bit, and his other hand would go toward his coat, and Rowan would not wait to find out what was in the coat. She would do exactly what Garrick had told her. She would shoot the gray horse. She would shoot it in the chest at 4 feet of range, and the horse would go down with a sound she would hear in her sleep for weeks afterward. And the man would fall with it because his foot would still be in the stirrup, and Rowan would put her heels into the mare, and the mare would surge past the falling horse and the falling man, and she would not look back. She would ride for an hour at a hard trot through the snow, and her hands inside the second pair of gloves would not stop shaking. And she would arrive at the railhead at Sage Crossing 2 hours after dark, with the mare blowing and white at the chest and her own face frozen along the cheekbones where the tears had gone to ice. She would not tell the station master what had happened. She would send the telegram. The telegram would read, "To J. Whitaker, District Attorney, Ashbury. The matter you closed has reopened in the territory. Damian Crow is the second name. I have the records. I require a federal marshal, R. Mercer." She would pay for the telegram with one of Mira Stone's gold coins, broken into change by the station master who did not ask where she had gotten it. She would take a room above the depot for 4 hours. She would not sleep. She would feed the mare a double ration of oats out of her own coat pocket. She would ride out at first light and be back on Garrick's Mountain by the second nightfall, 4 hours later than she had told him. And he would meet her at the bottom of the meadow on the dark horse with the larger rifle across his saddle, and he would not say anything when he saw her face. He would simply turn the dark horse and ride beside her up the meadow in silence, very close, his knee almost touching hers. And at the cabin he would lift her down from the mare without asking and carry her inside, and he would put her in the chair by the stove and pull her boots off her himself. And only then, when she was warm and the kettle was on, would he say, in a voice she had not heard from him before, low and a little rough, What did you do? I shot a man's horse. Where? In the Notch, 40 miles south. Was the man on it? Yes. I think his leg is broken. I did not stop. Good. Garrick. I am not sorry I did it. I am not asking you to be sorry. She started to cry then, finally, the first time she had cried since the morning at Lyle Street 11 months earlier, and he did not move to touch her. He stood at the stove with his back to her, and he poured hot water into the basin, and he carried the basin over and set it on the floor by her chair, and he knelt down in front of her with his enormous shoulders and his careful hands, and he washed her feet in the warm water, and he did not look up at her face while she cried, because he understood, the way he understood most things about her without being told, that she did not want to be looked at while she did it. When she stopped, he stood. He emptied the basin into the slop bucket. He went to the cupboard. He took down the tin of coffee. He put coffee into the pot. Tomorrow, he said. Tomorrow. I'm going to Esther's and the Vaughns. And then I'm going to a man named Albert Reyes, who has a freight wagon and a brother who is a deputy in Pine Bluff, which is the next territorial seat over. And then I am coming home and we are going to write a list. What list? Every name in your journal that we can put a body to. Every body in the valley that has a name in your journal next to it. And then we are going to start writing to those bodies, one a day, and we are going to put the journal in their hands and say, this is your story too. Garrick. There are 41 names. Then we will be busy. She laughed. It came out of her wet and ragged, but it was a laugh. He did not turn around from the stove, but the line of his big shoulders moved a little, and she knew he had smiled. Finally, the real one, the one that crinkled at the eyes. He poured the coffee. He brought her a cup. He sat down across the table from her with his own cup, and they sat in the lamplight, and they began to write the list. It would take them 11 days. It would take them 11 days, and at the end of the 11th day, the harvest gathering would be 3 weeks off, and 26 of the 41 names in the journal would have a face that Rowan Mercer had now seen with her own eyes, and a hand that she had now shaken, and a story she had now heard told across a kitchen table, or a corral fence, or a feed store counter. 16 of those 26 would agree, in plain words, to stand up at the gathering if she asked them to. 3 more would not agree out loud, but would, Garrick said privately to her as they rode home, show up anyway. The remaining 7 would do nothing, and Rowan would not blame them, because she had been one of those 7 herself for the 8 days she had sat in a cell in Ashbury, saying nothing because she had thought no one would listen. And on the 12th day, just at evening, when they were rubbing the dark horse down in the small barn behind the smokehouse, and Rowan was telling Garrick about the widow at the Pence place who had wept into a dish towel and then signed her name to a written statement with a hand that did not shake at all, the wind dropped. Just dropped, the way it does sometimes high up when a front moves through. The pines went quiet. The cow Iris stopped chewing for a moment in her stall. The dark horse lifted its head and pricked its ears toward the south, and down at the foot of the meadow, where the road came out of the pines, the small flat sound of a single horse moving at a walk, slowly, deliberately, in no hurry at all. Garrick set the brush down. He reached for the larger rifle on the peg by the door. He did not say anything. He stepped to the small barn window and looked out. Who? Rowan said. A man on a sorrel. Alone. Alone. Crow. No, not Crow. Who? Garrick was quiet a moment. I don't know him. He's got a leather case strapped behind the saddle. He's coming up like a man who's been invited. Rowan went very cold. Not the cold of the Notch, not the cold of the ride to Sage Crossing. A different cold. The cold of recognition before the eyes have caught up. She stepped to the window beside him. She looked down the meadow at the man on the sorrel, who was still 100 yards off, picking his way up through the last of the slush at the edge of the road. He was tall and lean in the saddle, and the snow had darkened the shoulders of his black coat, and from under the brim of his hat she could see a piece of hair the color of wet straw. She had never seen the man's face. She had only ever seen the signature on 3 forged transfer drafts in a courtroom in Ashbury 11 months ago, where the prosecutor had laid them out on a table and a handwriting expert had said, "No, this is not the same hand as the defendant's," and where Rowan, looking at the careful, precise loops of the false R in Rowan Mercer, had understood for the first time that whoever had forged her name was not her brother, Her brother's hand was sloppy. Her brother's hand was the hand of a boy who had cheated on his Latin. This hand had been the hand of a craftsman. Garrick. That is the man who forged my name. He did not ask her how she knew. He had stopped, somewhere in the last 10 weeks, asking her how she knew things. He cocked the larger rifle. The sound was very small in the quiet barn. Outside, the sorrel kept walking up the meadow, slow and unhurried, as if its rider had all the time in the world. Garrick lowered the rifle just an inch, not down. An inch. "Don't go out," he said. "He's seen the smoke. He knows we're here." "He doesn't know who is here." "He knows." "Garrick. He has known since he left the Halverson." Garrick made a small sound in his throat that was not agreement and not disagreement. It was the sound a man made when he was deciding which of two bad choices was the less bad. He set the larger rifle against the wall, butt down, in the corner where he could reach it without taking a full step. He did not take his coat off. He did not button it either. "You stay in the barn." "No." "Rowan." "No. He came up the road to see my face. He has come a long way for it. I am not going to make him work harder." "That is exactly what I'm asking you to do." "I know what you are asking. I'm telling you no." He looked at her for a moment in the half-dark of the barn, the way he had looked at her on the first afternoon when he had not known yet whether to send her down the mountain with Pell. The look had a different weight now. He was not appraising her. He was, she understood, asking her, in the only way a man like him asked, to stay alive. She put her hand on his forearm. She had not, before that moment, put her hand on him on purpose, not since the night she had stitched his arm. 2 minutes, she said. "Let me look at him for 2 minutes from the cabin door. Then I come back to the barn. Then we both stay here. He will not come into a barn after a man with a rifle. He is not that kind of man. You can read him already." "I have read every line he ever wrote in my name. Yes, I can read him." He breathed out. He picked the rifle back up. 2 minutes. They went out of the small barn together by the side door into the slow-falling snow. The air had the wet woolen smell that came before a real cold snap. Rowan walked across the yard to the cabin step without hurrying, and Garrick stayed a half pace behind her on her right, where his rifle hand was clear. The man on the sorrel was 40 yards off now, just past the last fence post. He had seen them. He had lifted his hand from the reins, slow and open-palmed, the way a man does when he wants to be sure no one mistakes him for a man with a weapon. He stopped the sorrel 10 feet from the step. He did not get down. "Mrs. Stone." "Miss Mercer." "My apology. Miss Mercer. I had been told otherwise." "By whom?" "By a clerk in Cold Hollow whose name will not interest you." His voice was educated and quiet, and had the kind of carry that meant he had not raised it once in 20 years. The warm brown eyes Crow had had at the Halverson breakfast table were not on this face. This face had pale eyes, paler even than Garrick's, almost gray as river ice, set above a clean shave that the cold had reddened at the chin. The piece of straw-colored hair under the hat was wet at the temples. "My name is Henry Sellers. I have come up to introduce myself before our paths cross in town, since I understand they are about to." "They are." "Yes. Did Crow send you?" "Mr. Crow is aware that I am paying this call. He did not send me. I do not, as a rule, allow myself to be sent." That is the kind of sentence a sent man would say. A small movement at the corner of Sellers's mouth, not quite a smile. Fairly observed. Garrick behind her shifted his weight. The rifle had not come up. It had not gone down either. The sorrel, which was a well-broken animal, was standing with its ears forward and its breath coming out in 2 long plumes, and Sellers had not yet, in the whole of the exchange, looked at Garrick. "Mr. Stone." "Sellers. I am told you are a man who can be reasoned with when the reasoning is fair. You were told wrong about the first part. The second part I can't argue with. Then I will be brief, since I appear to be standing on a cold horse. I have come up to tell Miss Mercer 2 things she has a right to know before the harvest gathering, and to tell you, Mr. Stone, 1 thing you have a right to know about the woman in your house. After I have said all 3, I will ride back down. I will not ask to come inside. I will not ask for water. I will not ask for the time." "All right." Sellers looked at Rowan. He did not look long. He looked exactly as long as a man with manners looks at a woman he has come to ruin. The first thing, Miss Mercer, is that I have in my saddle case 3 documents bearing your signature. I drafted them in October of last year in the back office of a notary in Ashbury whose name I will not speak in this country. They authorized the transfer of a parcel of land in Schuylkill County, Pennsylvania, from a woman named Hester Pence to a corporation in which you and your brother are listed as co-principals. You did not sign them. I signed them. I'm telling you this so that you understand, before we meet again in public, that the version of you that exists on paper in 3 eastern counties is more thorough than the version that sits in your cabin, and that if it comes to a contest in front of a federal judge between paper and breath, paper has been winning that contest for some time. The snow kept falling. Rowan did not move. Garrick, behind her, did not move. Inside the cabin, very faintly, the kettle began to sing on the stove. The second thing, Sellers said, is that the man you sent your telegram to in Ashbury, Mr. Whitaker of the district attorney's office, has been a friend of Mr. Crow's investments for 11 years. He did not fail you by accident, Miss Mercer. He failed you on purpose, and he is at this hour preparing a reply to your wire that will assure you, in warm language, that the federal marshal you have asked for is being arranged. No marshal is being arranged. No marshal is coming. She had been holding her breath. She let it out. You have come a long way, she said, to tell me this. I have. Why? Because Mr. Crow wishes for you to be made small at the gathering, and a frightened woman makes herself smaller than any man can. I am saving him the trouble of frightening you in public. He prefers efficiency. And the third thing, for my husband. The word husband came out of her without her deciding to use it. She felt Garrick, behind her, take a small breath in. Sellers heard it too. The almost smile moved again at the corner of his mouth. Mr. Stone, the third thing is for you. The woman standing in front of you is, in fact, the woman she has told you she is. Everything she has said about her brother is true. Everything she has said about Mr. Crow is true. Everything she has not yet said about me is also true. I am telling you this because you strike me as a man who could be of use to himself if he were given accurate information, and you have not been given any accurate information by anyone in this valley for 6 years. Good day to you both. He touched the brim of his hat. He did not turn the sorrel. He backed it 4 steps, the way a man backs a horse who has been schooled to it, until he had room. Then he turned it on its hocks and walked it, not trotted, walked it back down the meadow toward the pines, slow and deliberate and easy in the saddle, as if he had all afternoon and had only come up to deliver a calling card. Rowan and Garrick stood on the step until the sorrel disappeared into the dark line of the trees. Inside, Garrick said. They went inside. He latched the door. He took the kettle off the stove. He set it back down on the side where the iron was cooler. He set the rifle on the table. He did not sit down. He stood with his back to the door, with his big arms hanging at his sides, and he looked at her across the cabin for a moment without speaking. He just confessed to 3 felonies in front of a witness, she said. He did. Garrick, he admitted that he forged my name. He admitted it. There's no reason for him to do that unless he is sure no court in this territory will hear it. Yes. Or unless he is doing what a chess player does when he sets a piece in the open, putting it there to draw the eye. Or both. Or both. She sat down hard on the bunk. The straw tick crunched under her. She put her face in her hands for a moment. Not to cry, she was past crying. She was at the cold, flat place a person when after crying had stopped helping. They've got Whitaker. They've got Whitaker. Then there is no marshal. Then everything I told the people in this valley I would have at the gathering, I do not have. You have the journal. You have the statements. You have 16 people who said in their own kitchens that they would stand up. 16 people are not a federal marshal, Garrick. No, they are not. But 16 people are 16 people. That is also a thing. She lifted her face. He was looking at her steadily, with the pale gray eyes that had, somewhere in the last 10 weeks, stopped frightening her and started doing the opposite of frightening her, although she had no word yet for what the opposite was. He came up here for a reason we have not understood yet, she said. He came up here for 2 reasons. The first was the one he told us. The second is that he wanted to see me. You. He wanted to know what kind of man you walked into. He wanted to know whether I was a man Crow could buy or a man Crow was going to have to do something else with. He has decided. I do not know which one he has decided. He left without trying you. He left because trying me at a doorstep with a rifle in my hand was bad arithmetic. He will try me somewhere with worse light. He is a careful man. Did you see his hands? I saw them. He has never lifted anything heavier than a pen in his life. He will not come for me himself. He will hire it out. And whoever he hires will not be a freelancer from a feed store. It will be a man with a habit of getting the work done. She closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, she said, "Then we cannot wait 3 weeks. No, we cannot." How long? A week, maybe. Until he understands we are not running. Then he will move. And if we are still on this mountain when he moves, we are inside his house, not him in ours. Then we go down. We go down. He came across the cabin then. He sat on the edge of the bunk beside her. He did not touch her. He put his hands on his knees and looked at the floor between his boots. Rowan. Yes. There is a thing I have not said. Say it. If we do this and we lose, you will not be able to stay in this country. You understand? I understand. There is a man I rode with in the war who runs a sawmill in the Oregon Territory. He owes me a debt. I have not called it. If we lose, I am going to call it. I'm going to put you on a stage in Sage Crossing under a name we make up, and you are going to him, and you are going to disappear into that country for 2 years. You're not going to write me. You're not going to send word. You're going to live, and you're going to live quietly, and at the end of 2 years, I am going to come find you if I am still able. Do you understand me? She did not say anything for a long moment. You are telling me, she said carefully, that if we lose, you are going to stay here and let them come. I am telling you that I am not going to be the bait you ride away from. I am telling you that if we lose, I will buy you the time to get to Sage Crossing, and that buying that time has a price, and that the price will be what it is. Garrick. I'm not going to Oregon Territory. You will if I tell Esther to put you on that stage. Esther is not going to put me on any stage. Esther will do what I ask her to do. Esther owes me her husband's grave dug in frozen ground 3 winters ago. Esther will pick you up and put you on that stage if you're bleeding. Garrick, I'm telling you the plan, Rowan. I'm not asking you to vote on it. She stared at the side of his face. He would not look at her. The lamp was burning low on the table, and the side of his face was half lit and half in shadow, and the scar at the corner of his mouth was white in the dark beard. And she understood, with a sudden hot anger that surprised her, that this enormous, frightening man had been making this plan since the night she had brought the journal up the loft ladder and put it under his pillow, possibly since before. You absolute fool, she said. He did look at her then. Beg pardon. You absolute fool, Garrick Stone. You think I came up this mountain to be carried off it by Esther Halloran? You think I sat in a cell in Ashbury for 8 days and walked out and spent 11 months writing names in a black book by lamplight so that I could be saved by a man? You think any of it, has been about being saved? I think you came up this mountain to live. I came up this mountain because the only honest sentence I had read in a year was written by you, and because I had nothing left in the East, and because I wanted to be in a place where I could put a man like my brother on the floor of a courtroom and watch his face when he understood that I had been the one who put him there. I did not come up this mountain to be told by you that we have a losing plan and that you have already decided who is going to die in it. He did not answer. She kept going. She had not, in 11 months, raised her voice to anyone, and she was not raising it now, but the words came out of her flat and clean and the way a knife came out of a sheath. If we are going down, we are going down together. If I get on a stage to Oregon Territory, I am getting on it next to you in the seat. If you're going to buy me time, you're going to buy us both time. If we lose where the other one can see it. I am not going to spend 2 years in a sawmill in another territory wondering whether the wagon coming up the mountain road that day was the one that took you off it. Do you understand me? She was crying now. She had not known she was going to. The tears were hot on her face. She did not lift a hand to them. Neither did he. Rowan. Yes. Sit there a minute. She sat there a minute. He got up. He went to the cupboard. He took down a small wooden box she had never seen him touch. He brought it back to the bunk. He sat down again. He opened the box on his knee. Inside the box was a folded paper, and under the paper a small velvet pouch. He unfolded the paper. He did not give it to her. He held it so she could see. It was a marriage license, Cold Hollow Territorial Register, dated 3 weeks ago. The names on it were Garrick David Stone and Rowan Eliza Mercer, and the second name was written in a hand she had never put on a license and had never given anyone permission to put on one. Garrick. Esther got it for me. The clerk in Cold Hollow is sweet on Esther's older girl. He filed it without asking too much. It is recorded. You filed a marriage license without telling me. I filed a marriage license without telling you. Why? Because if a thing happens to me and you are not my wife in writing, the land goes to a cousin in Ohio I have not seen since I was 12. If you are my wife in writing, the land is yours. The house is yours. The cow is yours. Mira's coins are yours. The southwest quarter that Crow wants is yours. You can sell it for 40 times what he offered to anyone in this valley who will not sell it back to him. And there are 3 of those, and Esther knows their names. I am telling you about it now because I am not going to let you get on a stage in Sage Crossing under a made-up name and find out 2 months later in Oregon Territory that I left you the mountain without telling you. You are telling me, she said slowly, that you married me on paper without telling me, so that if you die in the fight we picked together, I will not be poor while I run. That is what I am telling you. She started to laugh. It came out of her cracked and wet and a little high and not entirely sane, the kind of laugh that came at the end of a very long day in a year that had had too many of them. He sat very still on the edge of the bunk with the license open on his knee and watched her laugh. And after a moment, slowly, with the careful, deliberate movement of a man who was not sure whether the gesture would be returned, he put one of his hands over one of hers. His hand was very warm. It was as large as she remembered it being on her waist that day on the ladder, and it covered hers completely, and it was not soft. It was the hand of a man who split his own wood and dug his own graves and stitched his own harness, and it did not tremble, although she could feel a small, fast pulse in the wrist where it lay across hers. She turned her hand over under his. She laced her fingers into his. He looked at her then. The pale gray eyes were not pale anymore. They had gone dark with something she did not have a name for and did not need to have a name for. You are a fool, she said quietly. I am. You are my fool. I am. Then no Oregon. No Oregon. Then we go down to the valley, and we fight in the open, and if we lose in the open. Yes, and if we win, we burn that license. He almost laughed. He almost did. Why? Because I want you to ask me out loud, Garrick, with the words, in front of the cow, if you have to. I want you to ask me like a man who is asking and not like a man who is filing a deed. He looked down at the license. He looked at it for a long moment. He folded it. He put it back in the box. He closed the box. All right, he said. If we win, I burn it. And then I ask you, out loud, in front of the cow if I have to. Good. She did not let go of his hand. He did not let go of hers. They sat on the edge of the bunk in the lamplight for a while, not speaking, while outside the cabin the snow kept falling and somewhere a long way down the road, the sound of a sorrel walking through Pine Canyon was still echoing in the trees. In Rowan's memory, the way a bell echoes in a tower after the rope has been let go. Garrick. There is something Sellers said that he should not have said. Tell me. He said no marshal is coming. He said it like a man who knew, which means he knew that I sent a wire, which means he knew before he came up here, which means Whitaker wired him back, or wired Crow, before he ever came up this road. Yes. Which means there is a telegraph operator in Cold Hollow, or in Sage Crossing, or in Ashbury who is reading the wire traffic and selling it. There is. We need to know which one. I can ride down to Sage Crossing tomorrow. No, they will be watching the Sage Crossing Road for you now. Sellers came up the Sage Crossing Road. They saw him come up. They will be looking for the answer to come back down it. He thought about that. He nodded. Pine Bluff. Pine Bluff. Yes, you said Albert Rhea's brother is a deputy in Pine Bluff. He is. Then we go to Pine Bluff. Not to send a wire. To find a man who is not in any of these pockets. To put the journal in his hand and ask him to put it in his sheriff's hand. If the sheriff in Pine Bluff is also bought, we will know inside of 48 hours. Because a man who is bought cannot help looking at a journal full of his employer's enemies the way a thirsty man cannot help looking at a glass. Pine Bluff is 3 days. Then we leave at first light the day after tomorrow. Tomorrow we ride to Esther and we tell her everything. We give her a second copy. If we do not come back from Pine Bluff, she takes the copy and she takes it east on the Halverson freight wagon, all the way to a federal prosecutor in Cheyenne, whose name I will write down for her. She does not stop. She does not telegraph. She rides. Esther will do that. Esther will do that. He was quiet a moment. Rowan? Yes. There is one more thing I have to tell you, and then I am going to stop telling you things tonight. All right. The dark horse is mine. The mare is mine. The cow is mine. The smaller rifle was my mother's. I am not, in the strict sense the man Cold Hollow thinks I am. What does that mean? It means that the southwest quarter that Crow wants was bought 11 years ago by an aunt of mine who is dead. The aunt was a stone, but not the way I am a stone. The aunt's husband was an officer in the territorial militia who, before he was an officer in the territorial militia, was a man who had carried a federal commission in 3 states. He died with that commission in a writing desk in a house outside Boston, where my cousin keeps it. My cousin is the cousin in Ohio I mentioned. He is not 12 years old anymore. He is 46. He works in the office of a senator whose name you know. She stared at him. Garrick. I have not used it. I have not asked anyone to. I came west to be a man who split his own wood, and I have been one. But if we go to Pine Bluff and we put the journal in the right hands and we say, at the bottom of the page, this was witnessed by Garrick D. Stone, nephew of Colonel Theodore Stone, late of the Massachusetts 11th, there is a chance, not a sure thing, a chance, that a wire goes east that does not get read by Whitaker. You have been holding that in your pocket for 10 weeks. I have been holding that in my pocket for 11 years. 10 weeks is the new part. Why are you telling me now? Because you cried in the chair while I washed your feet, Rowan, and I have not been able to stop seeing it. And because if there is a card in my coat I have not played, and a man like Sellers is going to come back up this road in a week with men who know their work, then it is time to play it. And because I do not want to die on this mountain with a card still in my coat that might have kept us both alive. She looked at him for a long moment. All right, she said. All right. Garrick. You are full of surprises. I am full of one or two. Is there anything else you are not telling me? Tell me now. He thought about it. He thought about it seriously, with the way he had of going still and large. No, he said finally. That is the last of it. Good. Now sleep. I cannot sleep. Clara did not say anything. Clara sat down beside her and put a hand on her back and let her cry. Edmund and Garrick went into the next room and shut the door behind them, the way men of a certain kind close a door not to keep a thing private, but to give a woman the privacy she had not known she needed until the door was closed. She cried for about 4 minutes. She stopped. Clara handed her a clean handkerchief. Better? Better? You have not done that in a while. No. You will do it again before this is over. Do it in this house when you need to. The walls here have heard worse. The prosecutor came at 9 the next morning. His name was Alden Brisbane. He was 48 years old and built like a fence post, and had a way of sitting forward in a chair with his forearms on his thighs that made the chair look temporary. He sat in Edmund Stone's front room for 3 hours that first day, and went through the journal with Rowan page by page, and he did not flatter her, and he did not soften any of his questions. And at the end of the 3 hours, he closed the journal and looked at her. Mrs. Stone. Yes. Sellers is going to plead the day before we go in. He told my opposite number in Pennsylvania last week. The arrangement is signed. He will be a witness for us, not against us. I tell you that now, so that when you see him in the courtroom in a witness chair and not in a defendant's chair, you do not flinch. All right. Lucien is not pleading. His lawyer is a man named Holcomb out of Chicago who has been paid in cash by a person we have not yet identified. Holcomb is going to be unkind to you. He is going to be unkind in a particular way. He is going to suggest in front of the jury that you knew about the bank fraud in Ashbury before the auditor caught it. He is going to suggest that you wrote your brother a letter in September of that year that has been provided to him as part of discovery. The letter is real. You did write it. She went still. I wrote him a letter in September. You did. It is 1 page. It says, I have a copy here. You do not need to read it. It says you have noticed irregularities in the ledger you copy on Tuesdays, and that you are going to bring them to Mr. Purnell, who was the senior clerk. It says you wanted to give Lucien the chance to explain himself first. It is dated the 14th of September. The auditor found the irregularities on the 21st. She put her hands flat on her knees. I forgot that letter. I believe you. The jury will not necessarily believe you. Holcomb is going to use the letter to suggest that you were Lucien's accomplice for a week before you became his victim. He is going to ask you whether you confronted Lucien in the 7 days between the letter and the auditor's report. He is going to ask whether your brother offered you money. He is going to ask whether you accepted any. He is going to ask why you did not go to Mr. Purnell on the day you wrote the letter instead of the day after. Because I wanted to give my brother the chance to explain himself first. That is your answer. That is exactly your answer. You will say that sentence on the stand if Holcomb does not ask the question, because if he does not ask it, I will ask it on redirect. We are going to put that sentence in the jury's ear because it is the true sentence and because it is the sentence a person of conscience says. Do you understand? Yes. There's one more thing. All right. Holcomb is going to ask you, on the second or third day of cross, about a man named Thomas Vey. She blinked. I do not know that name. You do. You knew him as Tom. He was a clerk at First Maritime 2 desks down from you. He left the bank a week before the auditor's report. He has been located. He has been compensated to come east and testify that you and he had a romantic understanding that ended badly, and that during the period of that understanding you told him, in a private moment, that your brother was into something and that you were thinking about leaving it alone. The cabin in the mountains and the harvest gathering and the snow in the notch all went very far away for a second, and Rowan was, instead, in a stairwell on Lyle Street in Ashbury 14 months earlier, with a man's hand on her wrist that had stayed on her wrist a second longer than she had given him permission for. And she heard her own voice say, "In that stairwell, Tom, you have to let go now." And she heard him say, "Rowan, you cannot tell me you have not been thinking about it." And she remembered with a small, clean, cold clarity that she had taken her wrist back and gone up the stairs and not spoken to him again, and that the next week he had been gone. I never had a romantic understanding with Thomas Vey, Mr. Brisbane. I believe you. He held my wrist in a stairwell once. All right. I told him to let go. He did. I did not see him again. All right. Then on the second or third day of cross, when Mr. Holcomb says the words Thomas Vey in front of the jury, you are going to look him in the eye and you are going to say, Thomas Vey held my wrist in a stairwell once, and I told him to let go, and he did. And then you are going to stop talking. You are not going to explain. You are not going to qualify. You are going to give the sentence, and you are going to sit in the silence after it. Can you do that? I can do that. Good. She did, on the morning of the 8th day of the trial, exactly what Alden Brisbane had told her to do. Holcomb out of Chicago put his thumbs in his vest the way men of his cut did, and said, in the carrying voice that lawyers of that kind learned at a school they all seemed to have attended, "Mrs. Stone, do you know a man named Thomas Vey?" And Rowan said, "I do." And Holcomb said, "And were you not, Mrs. Stone, in a private understanding with Mr. Vey during the autumn of the year in question?" And Rowan looked at him and said, in her own voice, "Thomas Vey held my wrist in a stairwell once, and I told him to let go, and he did." And she stopped talking. The silence in the courtroom was the longest she had ever experienced. Holcomb opened his mouth. Holcomb closed his mouth. Holcomb said no further questions on that line, in a voice that was a half a note higher than his earlier voice, and one woman on the jury, a heavy woman in a brown bonnet who had not, in 8 days of trial, given any indication of what she thought, looked over at Rowan and gave her the smallest nod. And Rowan understood, in the half-second of that nod, that the trial had just turned. Sellers testified on the 9th day. He came into the courtroom in a plain dark suit with no watch chain and no walking stick, and he did not look at Crow at the defendant's table, and he did not look at Lucien beside him, and he answered Brisbane's questions in the same quiet, educated voice he had used on the cabin step in the snow. He named 11 years of forgeries. He named 243 documents. He named, in 3 separate sentences, The day in October of the year before when Crow had instructed him to draft and sign the 3 transfer drafts at First Maritime in Rowan's name, and the address of the notary's back office in Ashbury where the work had been done, and the name of the notary, who was already in custody in Pennsylvania. Holcomb cross-examined him for 2 hours. Holcomb tried, in the way Holcomb tried everything, to suggest that Sellers was a self-interested liar buying his own future, and Sellers, who had decided sometime in November to stop being the man Holcomb thought he was, answered each question with the same flat patience and did not raise his voice once. At the end of the 2 hours, Holcomb said, "No further questions," in a voice that was now a full note higher than his original voice, and Sellers stood up from the witness chair and walked between 2 bailiffs back to the cell where he was being held. And he did not look back. The jury went out on the afternoon of the 11th day. They came back in 4 hours and 11 minutes. Rowan was sitting in the front row of the gallery in the dark blue wool dress Clara Stone had given her on the second night, and Garrick was beside her in his one black suit that Edmund had had altered for him by a tailor on the second day because Garrick's shoulders had outgrown every coat he had ever owned. And they did not hold hands while the verdict was read, because Brisbane had asked them privately the night before not to, because a jury that had just come back was sometimes still watching. They sat with 6 inches between their shoulders. They did not touch. The foreman stood. The foreman read, "Guilty on every count for Crow, 23 counts. Guilty on every count for Sellers, 11 counts, with the sentencing arrangement to be honored. Guilty on every count for Lucian Mercer, 17 counts." Lucian turned his head when the foreman read his name. He turned his head and he looked, for the first time in the whole 9 days of the trial, at his sister in the front row of the gallery. He looked at her with the same loose, easy look he had used on her since she was 9 years old. The look that had always, since she was 9 years old, meant, "Rowan, fix this for me." And Rowan looked back at him and did not change her face, and she did not nod, and she did not shake her head, and after a long second Lucian looked away. She would never, in the rest of her life, see him outside a fence again. The judge sentenced on the morning of the 12th day. Crow 21 years at the federal penitentiary at Leavenworth. Sellers 8 years at the same. Lucian 14 at a closer federal facility because his lawyer, finally earning a piece of the cash he had been paid, argued some thin point about his client's mother's grave and the proximity thereof. The judge granted the closer facility and gave the 14 years and then said, in the dry way of judges, that should leave Mr. Mercer ample time to consider the use of his sister's signature. The gavel came down. Outside the courthouse, on the broad gray steps, with the cold March wind coming straight down the street from the prairie, Brisbane shook Rowan's hand and said, "Mrs. Stone, you were the best witness I have put on a stand in 11 years. I am telling you that not as flattery, but as the record." And Vance, the marshal, was there too, in a cleaner coat than the one she had first seen him in. And he did not shake her hand because he was not a man who shook women's hands as a general practice, but he tipped his hat very low and said, "Ma'am," in a voice that contained more than the word, and he turned and walked away down the courthouse steps without looking back. They stayed in Cheyenne another 4 days for the paperwork. The financial settlement took 2 of those days. The court ordered the seizure of Crow's holdings in the territory and the partial restitution of every name on the list Rowan had read from at the harvest gathering. The Pence widow in Pennsylvania would get her land back. The Vaughns would get their note canceled. The Halloran note, the one Crow had not been willing to dignify by speaking of in the assembly hall, was canceled on a separate page in a separate hand, and Esther's name was on a copy that Brisbane handed to Rowan and said, "Get this to her. I owe her too. I have never met her." On the 16th of March, they rode out of Cheyenne. Clara hugged Rowan at the gate again, longer this time, and Edmund shook Garrick's hand without speaking and held the handshake an extra second, and the small, neat man and his small, neat wife stood at the gate and watched their 2 cousins-in-law ride out of the city on the dark horse and the hired mule, and Edmund Stone said quietly to his wife, after they had gone around the corner, "I have been wrong about my cousin for 20 years, and Clara said, 'I knew that. Come inside, it is cold.'" The ride home was 5 days. The weather was kind enough for March. The snow on the high passes had started to soften. They came up the Cold Hollow Road on the evening of the 20th, and they did not stop in town because Bessie had wired ahead to say she would not forgive them if they stopped before they had been home for a night, and they came up the meadow in the last of the light, just as they had come down it 5 months earlier, and the cabin was where they had left it, and the smoke this time was in the chimney because Esther had been up that afternoon to lay a fire, and the cow Iris was in the corral and lifted her head and made the low complaining sound, and Garrick laughed out loud. They unsaddled. They led the horses in. They came into the cabin together. There was bread on the table. There was a covered pot of stew on the stove. There was a note on the bread in Esther's blocky hand that said, "Only I will see you on Sunday. Eat, sleep. Do not come down before Sunday." Rowan sat down at the two-plank table. She put her hands flat on the wood. She looked at her hands a long moment. "Garrick. It is done. It is done. I do not have anything left to do tomorrow except the chickens. And the rooster. And the rooster. But the rooster is, in the strict sense, your problem." "He is." She started to laugh. It came out of her the way her crying had come at Clara Stone's, without warning, and once it started, it did not stop for a long time. She laughed until her ribs hurt. She laughed until the tears came again. She laughed at nothing in particular and at everything at once. At 14 months of cells and rented rooms and trains and forgeries and snow and stairwells and stairwells and stairwells, at the foreman's voice reading her brother's name, at Holcomb's voice going a half note higher, at the woman in the brown bonnet nodding at her once, at Esther's note on the bread, at the rooster who had now passed in some quiet way into folklore between them, at Garrick standing in the middle of the cabin with his black trial coat hanging open over his suspenders, looking down at her with the pale gray eyes gone soft. And finally she stopped laughing, and she put her face in her hands on the table, and Garrick came and sat down across from her and put his big hand on the back of her neck, and did not say anything, because there was nothing left to say in words that night that would not be smaller than what had already been said in a courtroom in Cheyenne 4 days earlier by a foreman reading from a folded slip of paper. They ate the stew. They went to bed. The cabin was very warm. The mountain outside was very quiet. The fire in the stove popped once, and then again, and then settled. And somewhere out in the corral, the dark horse stamped his hoof and was still. And Iris in the small barn shifted her weight and was still. And a single owl spoke once a long way off down the valley. And Rowan, with her face against Garrick's shoulder under the gray blanket, listened to the mountain breathe the way she had listened to it on the first night 14 months earlier. And she understood with the slow, clean clarity of a person who had at last stopped having to prove anything, that she had not been wrong on that first night when she had thought, lying behind the linen curtain with a hand flat on her stomach over a black journal, that this place might one day be home. It was. It had become home so gradually that there had been no single hour she could point to and say, "Here, this was when it happened," the way a person could never quite point to the hour at which a season had turned. It had simply turned. The cabin she had walked into in October with 2 dresses and a journal and $3.40 had become, by some quiet arithmetic she had not been keeping, the place at the end of the road, the room at the top of the meadow, the bed she came back to. And the enormous frightening man whose chest she was breathing against in the dark had become, by the same arithmetic, the person on the other side of the bed when she came back to it. She did not know yet that she was already pregnant. She would know in 5 weeks, on a morning in late April, when the snow had finally come off the meadow and the first green was up at the south edge of the pasture, when she would stand at the basin one morning and not be able to look at the bacon Garrick had put on the plate. And she would understand, with a small quick lift of her heart that she had not felt before, what the not being able to look at the bacon meant. She would tell him that morning. He would sit down on the bunk and put his face in his hands for a long minute without speaking. When he lifted his face, it would be wet, and he would not pretend it was not, and he would say only, "Rowan," and she would say, "I know," and that would be the whole of the conversation. Because between 2 people who had stood at the foot of a stage in a territorial assembly hall and named a brother to his face in front of 200 people, between 2 people who had ridden home up a meadow at dusk with the smoke not in the chimney and built it back up themselves, between 2 people who had buried a marriage license in a stove and then asked the real question in front of the cow, there was not any more the requirement of long sentences. She would carry the child to term. She would name the child Mira, and the naming would be her idea and not his. And the first time he heard her say the name aloud, he would step out of the cabin into the yard and stand at the woodpile with his back to the door for 10 minutes before coming back in. And he would come back in red-eyed and steady and would not speak of it, and she would not require him to. That was all ahead of them. Tonight there was only the warm cabin and the mountain breathing outside, and the small, clear weight of the dark behind her closed eyes, and Garrick's heart beating slow and even under her cheek, and the long, deep peace of a person who had walked into a country looking for a place to hide and had found, instead, a place to be seen. She slept. The mountain kept watch. Spring came up the mountain the way it came up most years in that country, in fits and starts, with 3 days of mud and then a single hard freeze that broke a water bucket Rowan had left on the porch and made Garrick laugh at her for it, and then a long, slow week of warm wind from the south that took the snow off the meadow in patches and left the ground steaming in the morning sun. By the time Rowan stood at the basin one morning in late April and could not look at the bacon Garrick had put on the plate, the crocuses Esther had planted 2 springs earlier along the south wall of the cabin were up an inch out of the dirt, and the dark horse had begun shedding his winter coat in handfuls, and the world had, by the slow, steady arithmetic of mountains, decided to go on. She told him about the baby that morning, at the basin, with her hand on the rim of the bowl and her back to him. She did not turn around to say it. She said it to the small square window over the basin and to the meadow beyond it. Garrick. I am with child. She heard him set his fork down. She heard the small, careful sound of a man putting a fork down with both hands so it would not clatter. She heard him stand. She heard him cross the cabin floor. She did not turn around. He came up behind her and put his hands on her shoulders, very light, and stood there for a moment without saying anything, and then he turned her by the shoulders to face him, and his face was the face of a man who had been carrying something for a long time and had just been told he was allowed to set it down. Rowan, I know. How long? 5 weeks, maybe 6. I am not certain of the count. Are you I am tired in the afternoons. I cannot look at meat in the morning. I am otherwise the same. You sit down. I am at the basin, Garrick, not on a horse. You sit down anyway. He walked her 2 steps to the chair by the table and sat her in it. He went out of the cabin without putting on his coat. He came back 2 minutes later with the rocking chair he had been building all winter in the shed behind the smokehouse, the one she had pretended not to notice him working on, the one he had pretended he was building for Esther's older girl. He set it down in the corner of the cabin by the stove. He looked at it. He looked at Rowan. That is not for Esther's girl. No, it never was. No? Garrick. It is the ugliest chair I have ever seen. He laughed. He laughed the real one, the one that crinkled at the eyes, and he sat down on the bunk and put his face in his hands for a long minute without speaking, and when he lifted his face it was wet, and he did not pretend it was not. He said only, Rowan. She said, I know. That was the whole of the conversation, because between 2 people who had stood at the foot of a stage in a territorial assembly hall 5 months earlier and named a brother to his face in front of 200 people, between 2 people who had ridden home up a meadow at dusk in November and built the fire back up themselves, between 2 people who had buried a marriage license in a stove and asked the real question in front of the cow, there was not anymore the requirement of long sentences. Esther came up the road the next Sunday for her usual visit and was halfway through her first cup of coffee before she set the cup down very deliberately on the saucer and said, without looking at Rowan, When? November, we think. Esther. I will not say anything about it to anyone in the valley until you tell me to. Not even to my own girls. You tell me when. I have buried 2 of my own in this country, Rowan. I know how the first months are. Thank you. You will not be thanking me for that. You will be thanking me in October when I am sleeping in your loft because Garrick does not know one end of a midwife from the other. He does not. I do not either, but I have seen the work done 6 times, and that is 6 times more than him. You eat the eggs, child, the yellow part, every morning. I do not care if you cannot look at the meat. The yellow part of the egg you will eat. Esther. Eat them. She ate them. The summer was the slowest summer Rowan had ever lived through, and also the fastest. The slowness was in the days. The fastness was in the months. The garden Esther had helped her put in along the south wall came up green, and then ahead of itself, and then, by the second week of July, was a tangle of beans and squash and potato vines that Rowan moved through every evening with the back of her hand on the small of her back, and her stomach beginning to round into the front of her dress. Garrick had ripped out the inside wall between the loft and the small space behind it and rebuilt it as a real second room with a real floor and a real door. And he had done it in 3 weeks of evenings. And the day he hung the door, he stood back from it with his hammer in his hand and looked at it for so long that Rowan, in the doorway behind him, finally said, "What?" And he said only, "I should have done this for Mira." She did not answer. She had learned in the months since Cheyenne that there were rooms inside this man she was not always going to be invited into, and that her job in those moments was not to ask the door to open, but to be standing on the other side of it when it did. She stood. He turned. He looked at her. He put the hammer down on the floor. "I was a poor husband to her, Rowan. You were a young husband to her. I was both. You are not the same man you were." "No." "Then the room is for the child, Garrick. And the child is the child we are having, not the child you did not have. Those are two different children. Do not confuse them in your own house." He looked at her for a long second. He nodded. "All right. All right." He picked up the hammer. He hung the door. They did not speak of Mira again that summer, although Rowan noticed 2 weeks later that the daguerreotype from the tin box under the smokehouse floor had been moved from where they had kept it together in the wooden box on the top shelf to a small frame on the wall of the new room beside the window, in plain sight, where any visitor would be able to look at it. Garrick had not asked her permission to put it there. She had not required him to. She had stood in the doorway of the new room one afternoon when he was out splitting wood, and she had looked at the long, sober face of the dark-haired woman in the brass frame, and she had said quietly, out loud, to the woman in the picture, "I will be good to him. I am not a substitute. I will be good to him." And the woman in the picture had looked back at her with the same level dark gaze she had been looking at her with for 8 months. And Rowan had felt no answer come, because there was not one needed. The summer ran out. The aspens on the north slope turned in the first week of September. The geese went over the meadow in long, ragged lines in the second week, and Garrick stopped them both at the woodpile one afternoon to watch a particular flight come down low over the corral. And the dark horse lifted his head and watched the geese the way the dark horse watched all things that moved against the sky. And Rowan, with her hand on the small of her back, said, "We should write to Edmund and Clara." And Garrick said, "I already did." And she said, "Of course you did," and they went on stacking wood. The child came on the second day of November. It came at 4 in the morning in a snow that had begun the evening before and had not by then stopped. Esther was in the loft, exactly as she had said she would be. And she had been in the loft for 9 days because she had decided on the 24th of October that she was not going to be 3 miles down the valley when the time came. The labor was 12 hours. It was not, in Esther's later words to Bessie Halverson, anything you would call easy, but not the worst I have walked a woman through. Rowan did not remember most of it afterward. She remembered the heat of the stove against the side of her face when the contractions were close. She remembered Garrick's hand under her left hand, the same warm, large, rough hand she had taken on the bunk the night he had told her about Oregon, and the hand had not been steady that night, and the hand was not steady this night either, and she remembered being glad of that. She remembered Esther's voice saying, low and flat, "One more, Rowan, one more. You have it, you have it." And she remembered the small, startled cry of a thing that had not, until that moment, ever made a sound in the world. And she remembered Esther's hands moving fast and competent in the lamplight, and then Esther saying, "A girl, child, you have a girl." And Garrick's face, very close, looking down at her with the pale gray eyes gone soft in a way she had not seen them go before. They named her Mira. Garrick did not ask. Rowan said the name first, on the morning after the birth, with the baby on her chest and the early light coming through the small window over the basin. Garrick was sitting on the edge of the bunk with a cup of coffee in his hands that he had not yet drunk from, and Rowan said Mira. And he looked up, and she said Mira Halloran Stone, and the second name was a thing she had decided on her own a week earlier and had not told him. And he looked at the baby on her chest, and then at Rowan, and then at the baby again, and he set the coffee down on the floor and stood up and went out of the cabin without his coat. He stood at the woodpile with his back to the door for 10 minutes before coming back in. He came back in red-eyed and steady. He sat down on the bunk again. He picked up the coffee. He drank it. "Mira Halloran Stone." "Yes. Esther is going to cry. Esther is going to pretend she is not crying, Garrick. There is a difference." He almost smiled. Esther did, in fact, pretend she was not crying when she came up the loft ladder at 7 o'clock that morning with a clean sheet over her arm and stopped halfway across the room and was told the name. She set the sheet down on the chair. She wiped her eye once with the back of her wrist, briskly, as if she had got something in it. She said, "That is a fine name, child. That is a strong name." And she did not say anything else about it, and she went to the stove to put water on for the basin. And Rowan, watching the broad squared shoulders of the woman who had ridden up the mountain at a hard gallop on a dark horse with a torn notice in her glove a year earlier, understood with a small clean lift in her chest that she had, in 14 months, gathered around herself in this country a family she had not been born into and had not been given, but had built, board by board, the way Garrick had built the second room. The winter of Mira's first months was the easiest winter Rowan had lived through since she was a girl. The cabin was warm, and the new room held the heat, and the baby slept on a pad of folded blankets in the rocker by the stove for the first 6 weeks, and then in a cradle Edmund Stone sent up from Cheyenne by freight wagon at Christmas, a small oak cradle with a carved star at the head of it that Clara had ordered from a Mennonite carpenter outside of town, and that arrived with a folded note from Clara that said only, "For our little cousin." From the City Stones. Rowan wept over the note for an hour, and then composed herself and wrote back a long, careful letter that was the first letter she had written to anyone in 14 years, that was not, in some hidden way, a defense of herself. She did not write to her aunt. She did not write to anyone in Ashbury. She was, by then, finished writing east. The East had stopped being a direction that contained anything she wanted. The years went by. They went by the way years go in a place where the work is real and the seasons are honest. The second room got a third room beside it the summer Mira was 3, because Rowan was with child again, and this time it was a boy. They named him David, after Garrick's father, and David came into the world easier than his sister had, on a clear August afternoon with the door of the cabin standing open and Esther in the yard chasing the rooster, who was old by then and slow but still mean, and David came out without ceremony in the way of second children, and he was a thick, quiet baby who looked, from the first day, like his father in miniature. And Garrick stood over the cradle the first night and said, "Rowan, that is a serious face for a thing that is 1 day old." And Rowan said, "He has had your face since the moment he opened his eyes." And Garrick said, "I am sorry about that for him." And Rowan laughed, and David in the cradle did not change his expression. The cabin became a house. The single room with the linen curtain became a room with a real wall, and a real second bedroom, and a real third one, and a real porch that ran the length of the south side, and a real chicken coop with a real door that the rooster could not be mean through the bars of, and a long lean-to barn behind the smokehouse that Garrick built with 2 hired hands in the summer Mira was 5, because the herd had grown to 9 head of cattle by then, and Iris had become a grandmother twice over, and the cow Rowan had once been kicked by because the cow did not know her was now a fat, slow, elder presence in a stall by the door, who had to be walked past carefully because she would, if she thought no one was looking, lip the brim off a hat. Crow died in his 8th year at Leavenworth. Pneumonia, in February. The letter from the prison chaplain came up the road in the spring mail, and Rowan read it on the porch and then folded it and put it in the small wooden box on the top shelf where they kept the other papers, and she did not say anything to Garrick about it for 2 days. And then she said, "Crow is dead." And Garrick said, "When?" And she said, "February." And he said, "All right," and that was the whole of the conversation. Sellers served his 8 years. He served them quietly. He left the penitentiary a thinner man than he had gone in, and he went, by all the news that ever came up the road from Cheyenne, to a small town in Indiana where he opened a copy office and made his living for the rest of his life, writing other people's letters in his careful, educated hand. He did not write to Rowan. Rowan did not write to him. There was no further business between them, and both of them, in their different ways, seemed to have understood that. Lucien served 11 of his 14 years and was released on parole. In the spring, Mira was 12. He wrote a letter to the mountain 3 weeks after his release. The letter was a long letter, and the handwriting was loose and easy in the way Lucien's handwriting had always been, and it asked, in the polished, careful way of men of his kind, whether his sister might consider, after the long passage of time, the possibility of a reconciliation, perhaps a single visit, perhaps a short stay in a hotel in the territorial capital, while certain conversations were had between a brother and a sister who had, after all, only one mother and one father and one shared past. Rowan read the letter standing on the porch. She read it through once. She folded it. She walked it across the yard and out to the rubbish heap behind the chicken coop, where the household trash was burned every Sunday, and she laid the letter on top of the pile, and she walked back to the porch, and she did not say anything about it to Garrick, and Garrick, who had watched the whole walk from the porch steps with his coffee in his hand, did not ask. The letter burned on Sunday. Lucienne did not write again. Some doors, Rowan had learned by then, were doors a person closed and walked away from and did not reopen, and the not reopening was not a wound a person carried, but a piece of furniture a person owned and kept polished, the way one kept a strongbox or a good rifle. Mira grew up. She grew up tall and dark-haired like her father and clear-eyed like her mother, and stubborn in a way that was clearly the inheritance of both of them. And she could ride by 6 and shoot by 9 and milk a cow by 4 years old, and she went down to the small school in Cold Hollow at 7, and went down to the territorial school at 13, and went, at 17, to a women's college in Iowa that her mother had not heard of, and that Edmund Stone, in Cheyenne, had recommended in a long, careful letter, and she went on her own steam and came back on her own steam 4 years later with a small canvas suitcase and a degree in a leather folder and a determined chin and a young man in tow who was, as it turned out, the son of Alden Brisbane, the prosecutor, and who was studying the law at his father's old offices in Cheyenne. And the young man was nervous on the porch the first afternoon, and Garrick was unkind to him for exactly 7 minutes before deciding he would do, and Rowan had to go inside the kitchen and stand with her hand over her mouth at the window for a full minute to keep from laughing where the boy could see her. They were married the next summer. They were married on the porch of the house in the upper meadow, with Esther Halloran in a black dress beside Rowan, and Edmund and Clara up from Cheyenne, and Bessie Halverson, who was very old by then and walked with a stick and had buried 2 more husbands since the trial, and seemed determined to bury 1 more, and David, 16 and almost as tall as his father, standing very straight in a borrowed suit at his father's elbow. Mira wore a plain pale gray wool dress that Rowan had had made for her in Cheyenne, with a white collar that Rowan had embroidered herself in the long winter evenings, and the day was clear and cold, and the sky over the ridge was the blue it got in late September when the aspens had begun to turn, but the snow had not yet come. Mira and her young man went down to Cheyenne after the wedding. They settled there. They had 3 children of their own in the next 8 years, and the second of them, a girl, was the one who would, 22 years after the harvest gathering in Cold Hollow, sit in the front row of a federal courtroom in Cheyenne in a dark blue dress and listen to a clerk read her grandmother's name into the record as the founding member of the Territorial Widows and Orphans Relief Committee, and not cry because her grandmother had told her the night before, in a hotel room with the lights low, crying is a thing a person spends in private and saves up for, child, and it is not a thing you let strangers take from you in a public room. David stayed on the mountain. He grew up to be his father in a slightly smaller frame, and at 22 he married Esther Halloran's youngest granddaughter, a quiet, practical girl named Lila, who had inherited her grandmother's flat, short sentences and her own mother's gift for plain cooking, and David and Lila built a 3rd house on the upper meadow, 50 yards down from the original cabin, and they had 4 children, and the 4 children grew up running back and forth between the 2 houses with the casual confidence of children who do not, as a basic matter, know which kitchen they are going to eat supper in on any given evening. Garrick died in the winter of his 68th year. He died in his own bed in the room he had built for Mira's birth, with Rowan beside him, on a clear, cold January night with the stars over the ridge, as hard and as bright as Rowan had ever seen them. He had not been ill long. He had not been ill in the strict sense at all. He had simply, in the way certain men of that country went when their work was done, sat down in his chair on the porch one afternoon in late December, and not got up easily, and by the 2nd week of January he had stopped getting up at all, and on the night he died he was awake until almost the end, and he held her hand the whole time, and he said only, "Near the last, Rowan," and she said, "I know," and that was the whole of the conversation, because between 2 people who had eaten elk stew across a 2-plank table on the first night they had ever met, between 2 people who had walked out the front door of a territorial assembly hall 31 years earlier, with the cold, clean light coming down on them and the long road home still ahead, there was not by then the requirement of long sentences. She buried him on the south slope, where the first crocuses came up in the spring and where the wind off the ridge did not cut as hard. Esther was there. David was there. Mira came up from Cheyenne with her 3 children and her husband, who was by then a federal judge in his own right. Bessie was not there. Bessie had gone the autumn before. The grave was dug by David and his oldest boy in ground that had to be broken with a pick because of the frost, and it took them 2 days. Rowan did not watch them dig it. She stayed inside the house. On the 3rd day, they laid him in. She lived another 11 years. She lived them in the house on the mountain. She did not move down to town. She did not move down to Cheyenne to live with Mira, although Mira asked. She kept the chickens. She kept the small barn going for as long as she could, and then she gave the cattle to David and the chickens to Lila, and she kept only a single hen that laid under the porch, and a single old half-blind cat that Garrick had brought up the mountain her 6th winter, and that outlived him by 9 years, which Rowan considered a personal insult on the cat's part and forgave only grudgingly. She wrote letters. She wrote a great many letters in the last decade of her life to women in the territory she had never met, women who wrote to her after reading her name in a paper or hearing it from a neighbor, women who were in the kind of trouble she had been in once, women who had been blamed for what other people had done, women who were afraid to come forward, women who had come forward and been disbelieved. She answered every letter. She answered them in her own hand. She did not, in her answers, ever describe herself as someone who knew the answer. She described herself in every letter as someone who had been to the place the letter writer was writing from and who had, by some combination of stubbornness and luck and the kindness of one good neighbor, found a way out of that place, and who could not promise the same to anyone, but could promise that the place was not the whole world, and that the world was bigger than the room a person was currently being held in by it. She died in the spring of her 79th year. She died on the porch of the house in the upper meadow, in the rocking chair Garrick had built her the spring of Mira's coming, in the late afternoon, with Esther's youngest granddaughter, Lila, in the chair beside her. And they had been talking, Lila said afterward, about a particular kind of bread Lila's mother had used to bake. And Rowan had said, "I would like a piece of that." And Lila had said, "I will bake it tomorrow." And Rowan had closed her eyes for a moment and not opened them again. There was no struggle. There was no sound. The cat on the porch lifted its head and looked at her and put its head back down on its paws. They buried her on the south slope, beside Garrick. The stone was a single block of pale gray granite from a quarry 3 days east, carved by a man in Cheyenne whose name Mira's husband knew. It said only her name and the years, and beneath them a single sentence she had asked Mira to put there in a letter she had written 4 years before she died, and that Mira had kept folded in her desk in the city the whole time. She came up the mountain to disappear and stayed to be seen. That was all. The wind went on coming down off the ridge. The pines went on. The crocuses came up every spring along the south wall of the original cabin, which by then was the kitchen of a larger house, and would, in time, be the parlor of a still larger one, and Esther Halloran's great-granddaughters, and David's daughters, and Mira's daughters, and all the daughters that came after them grew up running through it without knowing, most of the time, that the smallest room in the back of the house, the one with the small square window over the basin, had been the whole world of a frightened woman with a journal in her coat on a cold October afternoon in the year she had come up the road in Pell's wagon with $3.40 in her glove. They grew up free of needing to know it, which was, Rowan had decided long before, the only kind of victory worth winning, the kind that did not need to be remembered to keep working, the kind that became, in the slow, steady way of mountains and weather, simply the country a person lived in, the air a person breathed, the porch a person sat on in the late afternoon with a cat on the boards and a piece of bread coming tomorrow and the sun going down behind a ridge that had, in the end, been kind to her, after all.